An old man saved a leopard cub stuck in a fence minutes later. She brought back something shocking. At first, it looked like a simple act of kindness, but what the cub dropped at his feet unlocked a mystery buried for years. A secret powerful men never wanted uncovered. Suddenly, this quiet stranger is thrown into a dangerous game where wild animals aren't the only predators lurking in the dark. With his life on the line and the past clawing its way back, one question looms. What deadly truth did that cub bring back, and how far will they go to keep him silent? I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The Texas sun hadn't fully risen when Hollis Greer stepped onto his creaky front porch, coffee mug warming his weathered hands. The morning air held that familiar bite of late autumn, making his joints ache more than usual. His tired eyes swept across the overgrown yard, taking in the rusty farm equipment and the old oak trees that had been there longer than he had. Another day, he muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. Living alone meant most of his conversations happened in his head these days. He adjusted the worn baseball cap on his gray hair and started his morning routine, checking the fence line that marked his property's boundaries. The fence inspection was something he'd done every morning for the past 15 years. Ever since Lark disappeared, some habits were hard to break, especially when they were born from hope and heartache. His boots crunched on the frost-covered grass as he walked, checking for any breaks or weak spots in the aging wire. Morning was quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the whisper of wind through the trees. That's why the sound caught his attention so quickly, a high-pitched cry that didn't belong among the usual morning noises. Hollis stopped, his whole body going still as he listened. There it was again, a distressed sound, something between a mewl and a whimper. It was coming from near the back corner of his property, where the fence met the thick brush that separated his land from the wilderness beyond. His heart picked up its pace as he quickened his steps, following the sound. What he found made him catch his breath. Tangled in the barbed wire, crying and struggling, was a leopard cub, not a house cat or a bobcat, but an honest-to-goodness leopard cub, its spotted coat unmistakable even in the dim morning light. The small creature's back leg was caught in the wire, and every movement only made the barbs dig deeper. "Easy there, little fella," Hollis said softly, approaching with careful steps. The cub's eyes, wild with fear, locked onto him. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Let's get you out of this mess." Getting closer, Hollis could see the cub couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its spotted coat was dusty, but otherwise, it looked healthy, or at least it would be, once it was free of the wire. The question of how a leopard cub ended up in rural Texas could wait. Hollis knelt beside the trapped animal, his knees protesting the movement. The cub made another distressed sound but didn't try to scratch or bite him. Something in those young eyes seemed almost trusting. "This might hurt a bit," Hollis warned, reaching for the wire. He'd need both hands to work the barbs free without causing more damage. Setting his coffee mug down, he began the delicate work of untangling the cub. The barbed wire was unforgiving. As Hollis worked to free the cub, the sharp points caught his own hands several times. Drawing blood, he barely noticed the pain, focused entirely on the task at hand. "Almost there," he murmured, more to himself than the cub. With one final careful movement, the wire came loose. The cub immediately pulled free, stumbling a bit before finding its footing. Instead of running away immediately, it turned to look at Hollis, their eyes meeting for a long moment. Then, with a flick of its tail, the cub disappeared into the brush. Hollis stayed kneeling in the grass, looking at his bleeding hands. "Well, that's something you don't see every day," he said to the empty air. His palms were covered in small cuts, and his old joints were complaining about the prolonged strain. Making his way back to the house, Hollis cleaned and bandaged his hands, his mind still on the strange encounter. He'd lived in this part of Texas his whole life and had never seen anything like that cub. Something about those eyes stayed with him. They'd seemed almost familiar. The morning passed slowly, as mornings tend to do when you're alone. Hollis puttered around his workshop, trying to keep his hands busy despite the cuts. He'd always found peace in working with wood, creating small pieces that would never be masterpieces, but carried their own simple beauty. It was late afternoon when he heard something outside, a small sound like pebbles being scattered. Hollis stepped out of his workshop, squinting in the bright sunlight. There, not 10 feet from his door, stood the leopard cub from that morning. Before Hollis could move or speak, the cub dropped something from its mouth. The small object fell into the dirt with a soft thud. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the cub turned and ran, disappearing once again into the brush. Hollis's heart was pounding as he approached the spot where the cub had stood. There, half buried in the Texas dirt, was something he recognized instantly, something that made his knees go weak and his breath catch in his throat. It was a small wooden charm in the shape of a bluebird, its blue paint faded but still visible. His hands trembled as he picked it up, memories flooding back with overwhelming force. He had carved this charm himself, 15 years ago, for his daughter Lark's 10th birthday. She had worn it on a leather cord around her neck every day, until the day she vanished. Hollis sank to his knees, holding the tiny bluebird in his bandaged palm. The wood was worn smooth, but he could still feel the little imperfections in the carving, the slightly uneven wing, the small knot in the wood that had made one eye larger than the other. He had apologized to Lark for those imperfections, but she had declared it perfect, exactly as it was. "This ain't possible," he whispered, his voice shaking. But there it was, real and solid in his hand. The last gift he'd given his daughter before she disappeared without a trace. The same charm that police had never found, that had vanished along with her on that summer morning 15 years ago. Questions raced through his mind. How had that cub found this charm? Where had it been all these years? And most importantly, what did this mean about Lark? The coincidence was too great to ignore. This had to mean something. For 15 years, he'd lived with the gnawing uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to his little girl. The police had eventually closed the case, but Hollis had never stopped hoping, never stopped checking the fence line every morning, never stopped watching for any sign of her. Now, holding this small wooden bird that had somehow found its way back to him through the most unlikely messenger, Hollis felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, real, tangible hope that maybe, just maybe, this was more than a coincidence. Maybe this was the beginning of finally understanding what had happened to Lark. His hands were shaking as he carefully tucked the charm into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The cuts from the barbed wire stung, but he barely noticed the pain. His mind was already racing, trying to make connections, trying to understand what this could mean. The sun was setting now, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Hollis stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, but his spirit feeling lighter than it had in years. He looked toward the brush where the cub had disappeared, then down at his bandaged hands, then touched the pocket where the charm rested. "Don't know what this means, Lark," he said softly to the evening air, "but I'm gonna find out. That's a promise." The wooden bluebird charm felt impossibly heavy in Hollis' Greer's weathered palm as he steered his old pickup truck down the dusty county road. His scarred hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white with tension. That charm, Lark's charm, shouldn't be here, not after all these years. Not delivered by some mystery leopard cub that had no business being in Texas Hill Country. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center appeared ahead. A modest collection of metal buildings and outdoor enclosures set back from the road. The hand-painted sign reading Cypress County Wildlife Rescue was faded but still legible. Hollis had driven past it hundreds of times but never had reason to stop until now. He parked in the gravel lot and sat for a moment. Gathering his courage, the morning sun beat down on the truck's cab as he studied the charm one last time before tucking it into his shirt pocket. With a deep breath, he stepped out into the heat. A woman in her mid-30s emerged from the main building, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her canvas work shirt had the sleeves rolled up to reveal freckled arms. This had to be Marin. "Qualls, can I help you?" she called out, squinting against the sun. "Hope so," Hollis replied, his voice rough. "Name's Hollis Greer. Got something unusual to discuss with you, if you've got a minute." Marin's expression shifted from polite inquiry to sharp interest. "The rail mechanic from out past the preserve. I've heard about you." She gestured toward the building. "Come on in, where it's cooler. I've got coffee brewing." The interior was cluttered but clean, with the sharp smell of antiseptic underlying everything. Marin led him to a small office, clearing folders off a spare chair. "What brings you by, Mr. Greer?" Hollis settled into the chair, his joints protesting. "Had an odd encounter yesterday morning. Found a leopard cub caught in my fence." Marin, head snapped up. "A leopard? You're certain? Ain't my first big cat. Used to work some security jobs at the preserve years back." He pulled the charm from his pocket, turning it over in his hands. "But that's not the strangest part. The cub came back later, dropped this at my feet." He held out the wooden bluebird. Marin took it carefully, examining the detailed carving. "Beautiful work. But I don't understand. I made that charm 15 years ago, for my daughter Lark." Hollis's voice cracked slightly. "She disappeared not long after. Never found a trace of her." Marin's eyes widened as she looked between Hollis and the charm. "And now a leopard cub just happens to bring it to you. She shook her head. "That's not natural." "My thoughts exactly." Hollis leaned forward. "Folks say you've had your share of run-ins with Sloan's Preserve, that you don't trust how they operate." Marin's face hardened, for good reason. "That place isn't what it pretends to be. Merritt Sloan talks about conservation and education, but I've seen too many injured animals that clearly came from there. Animals with injuries that don't match their stories. And whenever I file reports, they mysteriously disappear." She stood and paced the small office. "A leopard cub shouldn't be anywhere near your property. The preserve claims all their big cats are properly contained. But if one got out," she turned to face Hollis, "this could be connected to something much darker." Hollis nodded slowly, been thinking the same. "Reckon it's time I paid Merritt Sloan a visit." "Be careful," Marin warned. "Sloan's got friends in high places. The kind of friends who make problems disappear." "Already disappeared. What matters most to me," Hollis said quietly, standing. "Can't lose much more." The preserve's main gates were imposing wrought iron decorated with wildlife silhouettes. The guard recognized Hollis's name and waved him through after a quick call to the main office. The winding drive led past carefully maintained enclosures, where tourists could view exotic animals from their vehicles. Sloane's office occupied the top floor of a rustic yet elegant lodge building. Hollis found him standing at the window, cutting an impressive figure in his tailored ranch where the man turned with a practiced smile. Hollis Greer, it's been years. Sloane's handshake was firm, confident. What brings you by? Hollis laid the charm on Sloane's desk without preamble. Found something interesting yesterday, along with a leopard cub that shouldn't have been loose on my property. The smile never left Sloane's face, but something flickered in his eyes. Leopard cub, that's quite a claim. All our animals are carefully contained and monitored. Perhaps you saw a large bobcat? Know what I saw, Hollis said flatly. Same way I know this charm belonged to my daughter. The daughter who vanished without a trace 15 years ago. Ah, Sloane's expression shifted to practiced sympathy. Lark's disappearance was a tragedy. The whole county grieved with you, but surely you're not suggesting. He spread his hands. What could a random animal possibly have to do with something that happened so long ago? Maybe nothing, Hollis admitted. Maybe something. Aim to find out either way. Sloane's smile thinned slightly. The past can be painful, Hollis. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. For everyone's sake, before Hollis could respond, heavy footsteps approached the office. Sheriff Duke Parrish filled the doorway, his uniform immaculate as always. Thought I recognized that truck outside. He nodded to Sloane. Everything all right here, Merritt? Just fine, Duke. Mr. Greer was leaving. The sheriff's hand rested casually on his belt, near his weapon. Let me walk you out. Hollis, we can have a chat. Out in the parking lot, Parrish's friendly demeanor vanished. Listen close. Greer, you start stirring up old troubles, asking questions about things best left alone. You're gonna find yourself in a world of hurt. This county runs smooth because folks know their place and mind their business. That a threat? Sheriff Hollis asked quietly. That's friendly advice from someone who remembers what happened last time you pushed too hard, asking questions about Lark. Parrish's voice was cold. Let it go for your own good. Hollis drove home in silence, his mind churning. The charm sat heavy in his pocket, a weight like stone. They were all connected. Sloane, Parrish, the missing reports Marin mentioned, maybe even Lark's disappearance. The power players in Cypress County wanted him to back down, to stay quiet. But that charm had found its way home after 15 years. His daughter's charm, delivered by an impossible messenger. Whatever darkness lurked behind Sloane's polished smile and Parrish's warnings, Hollis knew he couldn't walk away. Not again. Not this time. The truth was out there, hidden behind wealth, and influence and carefully maintained lies. And Hollis Greer had nothing left to lose. The pale dawn light crept across Hollis's weathered face as he crouched behind a cluster of mesquite trees at the preserve's edge. He'd been coming here every morning for the past week, watching and waiting. His old bones protested the prolonged stillness, but determination kept him rooted to his hiding spot. Through his binoculars, he studied the ground near the preserve's southern fence line. What caught his eye weren't the obvious paths, but the subtle ones, places where the grass had been carefully arranged to hide tracks. As a former rail mechanic, Hollis knew all about reading signs others might miss. Faint paw prints pressed into the soft earth, alongside distinctive tire tracks that someone had tried to brush away. See those tracks? He whispered to Marin, who knelt beside him in the early morning shadows. They're trying too hard to hide them. Marin nodded, her auburn hair tucked under a dark cap. Those tire treads match the preserve's utility vehicles. But why go through so much trouble to cover them up if everything's above board? The service road they'd discovered wound away from the main preserve attractions, hidden from visitors' view by thick brush and carefully positioned fencing, followed it at a distance, staying concealed in the vegetation. Around 9 o'clock, activity began. 2 handlers emerged from the service road in a mud-splattered utility vehicle. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking over their shoulders as they worked. What happened next made Hollis's breath catch in his throat. The handlers pulled out small, shiny objects, trinkets that caught the morning light. With practiced movements, they placed these items along specific points of the fence line. Within minutes, 3 leopards emerged from the brush, drawn to the glinting objects. They're training them, Marin breathed, her voice tight with anger, using trinkets to condition the cats to approach certain areas. But why? Hollis felt sick to his stomach as he watched. The leopards weren't just approaching the fence, they were retrieving the items with an unsettling familiarity. One cat even dropped its trinket into a handler's waiting hand, receiving a treat in return. This isn't about entertainment, Hollis said, his voice barely above a whisper. These cats aren't being trained for shows. They're being used for something else entirely. The pieces started falling into place, the hidden tracks, the secretive handlers, the carefully orchestrated training sessions far from public view. Sloane's Preserve wasn't the family-friendly safari attraction it claimed to be. It was a cover, a carefully constructed facade hiding something much darker. Marin gripped Hollis's arm. We need to document this. No one would believe us otherwise. She pulled out her phone, carefully capturing video of the handlers working with the cats. As they watched, Hollis's mind wandered back to Lark's disappearance. The wooden charm the cub had brought him, the preserve's proximity to where she was. Last seen Sloane's dismissive attitude, it all connected somehow. His daughter had discovered something here, something that had put her in danger. Lark knew, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She must have found out what was really happening. Here, that's why. He couldn't finish the sentence. But Marin understood. They stayed hidden until the handlers packed up and left. The morning's sinister training session complete. As they carefully made their way back to Marin's truck, parked well, away from the preserve, the weight of what they'd witnessed settled over them. This goes deeper than just animal exploitation, Marin said as they drove away. Sloane's got half the county in his pocket. The sheriff, the commissioners, they must all be involved somehow. Hollis stared out the window at the passing landscape, his jaw set in determination. All these years, I thought I was crazy for not believing the official story about Lark, but she was trying to expose something here, wasn't she? And they silenced her. The scope of Sloane's corruption was beginning to reveal itself, and it was more extensive than either of them had imagined. It wasn't just about questionable animal practices or local politics. It was about power, money, and secrets worth killing to protect. We need to be careful, Marin warned, her hands tight on the steering wheel. If what we think is true, these people won't hesitate to silence us too. Hollis nodded, touching the pocket where he kept Lark's charm. Being careful is what I did for years after Lark disappeared. Being careful didn't get me answers. Being careful didn't get me justice. He turned to face Marin, his expression resolute. I'm done being careful. I'm going to find out what happened to my daughter, and I'm going to make Sloane pay for every bit of it. The morning sun climbed higher in the Texas sky as they drove back to Marin's wildlife center, both of them processing the gravity of what they'd uncovered. The preserve's pristine fences and carefully maintained image now seemed sinister rather than impressive, hiding secrets that had already cost at least one life. Hollis stood in his garage, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his tools. His hands, though weathered and scarred, moved with practiced precision as he examined the small electronic device he'd removed from one of Sloane's tourist trams. During his last visit to the preserve, years of working on train engines had taught him that every machine had a weakness. Just like people, he muttered, carefully adjusting a wire. The modified control unit would cause the tram to shut down. Nothing dangerous, just inconvenient. Enough to create the distraction he needed. The next morning, Marin met him at their usual spot, her auburn hair tied back tight, determination etched on her face. You sure about this, Hollis? She whispered. He nodded, his grip tightening on his tool bag. Those tracks we found, they lead right past that maintenance shed. Something's in there they don't want folks seeing. They watched as the first tourist tram of the day began its route, loaded with excited families pointing cameras at the distant animals. Hollis held the modified remote in his palm, counting under his breath. When the tram reached the furthest point of its route, he pressed the button. The effect was immediate. The tram's engine sputtered and died with a wheeze that echoed across the preserve. Confused voices carried on the morning air as the tour guide tried to calm the frustrated passengers. Now, Hollis whispered. They moved quickly through the scrub, brush, keeping low. The maintenance shed stood isolated, its metal walls weathered by sun and wind. While the preserve staff scrambled to deal with the stranded tourists, Hollis made short work of the lock with tools that hadn't seen use since his rail yard days. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sharp smell of machine oil. Marin kept watch at the door while Hollis moved deeper into the shadows. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the wall of photographs detailed images of kennels hidden in locations across the preserve, each marked with coordinates and dates. Marin, he called softly, look at this. She joined him, her breath catching. These aren't normal enclosures. They're too small, too isolated. And look at these dates, they go back years. Hollis's hands trembled as he carefully removed several photos. Storing them in his jacket, a glint of metal caught his eye, and he discovered a ring of keys hanging on a hidden hook, each tagged with location codes. But it was what they found in an old filing cabinet that made his blood run cold, a detailed map of the preserve with markings that didn't appear on any tourist brochure. There, in a remote corner, was an irrigation pond carefully screened from public view by natural barriers. This isn't just about animal trading, Marin whispered, her voice tight with anger. They're hiding something bigger, something they never wanted anyone to find. Hollis carefully folded the map, adding it to their growing collection of evidence. Each item felt heavy with significance, proof that Sloane's preserve wasn't the family-friendly attraction it pretended to be. A distant voice made them freeze. Footsteps approached the shed, accompanied by the crunch of gravel. Marin quickly closed the filing cabinet while Hollis pocketed the keys. They slipped out through the back door just as someone entered through the front, ducking behind a stack of old equipment. The morning sun had climbed higher, making their escape more dangerous. They moved carefully through the brush, Hollis, heart pounding with each step. The weight of the evidence in his pockets felt like hope, solid, tangible proof that could finally expose Sloane's secrets when they reached safety. Hollis spread their findings on his kitchen table. The photos told a story of systematic deception. The map revealed carefully hidden facilities. The keys would open doors that Sloane never intended anyone to find. What now? Marin asked, her fingers tracing the outline of the hidden pond on the map. Hollis studied the evidence before them, his mind already forming plans. Now we follow where these lead us. Every locked gate, every hidden kennel, we check them all. He picked up one of the photos, studying the familiar charm visible in the corner of the frame. Somewhere in all this, we'll find the truth about Lark, and about everything else Sloane's been hiding. Marin squeezed his shoulder, understanding in her eyes. We're finally ahead of them, Hollis. They won't see us coming. He nodded, carefully organizing their findings. Each piece of evidence was another crack in Sloane's carefully constructed facade. For the first time since finding that wooden bluebird charm, Hollis felt real hope. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. The night air crackled with an unnatural heat. Hollis jolted awake in his workshop chair, his eyes stinging from thick smoke that poured through the gaps in the wooden walls. Red-orange flames licked up the sides of his beloved workshop, consuming decades of memories with frightening speed. Dear Lord, he gasped, stumbling to his feet. The smoke burned his lungs as he searched frantically for an escape route. Through watering eyes, he spotted the workshop's side door, now barely visible through the inferno. The heat intensified, and then he heard it, the distinctive hiss of propane tanks heating up. His heart nearly stopped. Those tanks, stored carefully against the back wall for his welding work, were about to turn his workshop into a bomb. Got to move, he wheezed, crouching low where the air was clearer. The wooden beams above groaned ominously as he shuffled forward, each second stretching into eternity. Just as his fingers touched the door handle, a deafening explosion rocked the building. The force threw him outside like a rag doll, and he landed hard on the gravel driveway. Gasping for clean air, Hollis rolled away from the inferno just as a second explosion sent burning debris raining down around him. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard the wail of approaching sirens. Sheriff Parrish's patrol car skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust, followed closely by fire trucks. The sheriff emerged, his face set in grim lines as he approached Hollis. Well, Parrish drawled, pulling out his handcuffs. Looks like someone's been mighty careless with dangerous materials. This wasn't an accident, Hollis protested, his voice rough from smoke. Someone set this fire. Save it for the judge, Parrish replied, roughly securing the cuffs around Hollis's wrists. You're under arrest for reckless endangerment. Could have killed half the county with those explosions. The ride to the county jail passed in a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Hollis sat in the cold cell, still smelling of smoke, his mind racing. This was Sloane's answer to their investigation. A warning wrapped in destruction. Morning brought Marin's determined face to the jail. I'm posting your bail, she announced, ignoring his attempts to protest. And you're coming to stay at the clinic. No arguments. Once released, they drove to survey the workshop's remains. The sight of his lifetime of tools and memories reduced to ash made Hollis's throat tight. But something caught Marin's eye as she picked carefully through the debris. Hollis, look at this, she called, holding up a partially burned brochure. The glossy paper was scorched around the edges, but the words Founder's Retreat were still clearly visible beneath the preserve's logo. This wasn't here before. Someone dropped it during the fire. Sloane's getting sloppy, Hollis observed, taking the brochure with careful fingers. He wanted us to know it was him, but he left us another piece of the puzzle instead. At the wildlife clinic, they found Juniper, as Marin had named the Leopard Cub, recovering well in a secure enclosure. The young cat's leg was healing nicely from the barbed wire injury, though she still moved with a slight limp. She's quite the fighter, Marin said softly, watching as the cub approached the enclosure fence to greet Hollis. Like someone else I know. Hollis reached through the fence to gently scratch behind Juniper's ears, earning a quiet purr. Sloane thinks he can scare us off by burning down my shop, but he just proved how desperate he is to keep his secrets. The Founder's Retreat, Marin mused, studying the brochure. It's mentioned here as a private lodge on the preserve's property, reserved for VIP guests, but it's not on any of the public maps. Then that's where we need to look next, Hollis replied, his determination stronger than ever. The fire had taken his workshop, but it had failed to break his spirit. If anything, Sloane's attempt to silence him had only confirmed they were getting close to the truth. As night fell, Hollis settled into the clinic's spare room, lulled by the distant sounds of the animals. Through his window, he could see Juniper's enclosure, the young cub sleeping peacefully under the stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they were safe, and they were one step closer to uncovering whatever dark secrets the Founder's Retreat held, and possibly, finally, the truth about what happened to Lark. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Hollis and Marin stood at the edge of the irrigation pond, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The recent storm had done exactly what they'd hoped, lowered the murky waters enough to make their midnight mission possible. You sure about this, Hollis? Marin whispered, adjusting the straps of her backpack filled with rope, hooks, and other dredging equipment they'd cobbled together. Never been more sure of anything, Hollis replied, his his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The pond had always seemed odd to him, too hidden, too protected by Sloane's men. Now he knew why. They worked in silence, methodically assembling their makeshift dredging system. Hollis's years as a mechanic guided his hands as he connected lengths of rope to heavy hooks. Marin proved surprisingly adept, her experience handling injured wildlife translating well to the delicate work. "There," she whispered, testing the strength of their contraption. "Let's start at the north end and work our way across." The first few passes yielded nothing but pond weeds and fallen branches. Hollis's heart pounded with each throw and retrieval, hope and dread warring in his chest. On their 7th attempt, the hooks caught on something solid. "Got something?" Marin said, muscles straining as she pulled. "It's heavy." Hollis joined her, and together they hauled on the ropes. Slowly, something large broke the surface first. A mud-covered roof, then the unmistakable shape of a car emerging from its watery grave. The sight hit Hollis like a physical blow. Even caked in years of pond muck, he knew that car. The distinctive dent in the passenger door, the small rainbow peace sign sticker in the back window that hadn't quite washed away. "That's—" his voice cracked. "That's Lark's sedan." Marin squeezed his shoulder as they secured the vehicle closer to shore. With trembling hands, Hollis wiped mud from the license plate. The numbers matched the ones burned into his memory from countless sleepless nights after Lark vanished. But it was the damage to the passenger side that told the real story. The deep, distinctive indentation perfectly matched the height and shape of the metal guard on Sloane's prized vintage cattle truck, the one he'd always kept spotlessly clean and prominently displayed at his ranch. "She didn't just disappear," Hollis whispered, his voice raw. "He ran her off the road, right into this pond." The truth he'd feared for years stood before him. Dripping pond water in the beam of their flashlights, Marin documented everything, with her phone's camera, her hands shaking almost as much as Hollis. "This is proof, Hollis. Real proof of what Sloane did." The grief that had lived in Hollis's heart for years transformed, crystallizing into something harder, sharper. All those times Sloane had looked him in the eye, offered false sympathy about Lark's disappearance, while knowing exactly what he'd done, the polished smile hiding a murderer's heart. "My girl?" Hollis whispered, pressing his palm against the mud-covered door. "I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. But I promise you this, he won't get away with it anymore." They worked quickly to document every angle of the car, knowing they couldn't risk being discovered. The evidence was undeniable. The distinctive damage pattern, the location on Sloane's protected property, the deliberate concealment in this hidden pond. "We need to call this in," Marin said quietly. "But not to Sheriff Parrish. He's too deep in Sloane's pocket. I know someone at the state police who might help." Hollis nodded, unable to take his eyes off Lark's car. His daughter's final resting place, hidden away by a man who'd built an empire on secrets and lies. The truth had been here all along, waiting to be discovered. The grief remained, as it always would. But now it burned alongside something else, a fierce determination to bring Sloane's crimes into the light. For Lark, for justice, for all the truths that had been silenced in murky waters. Thunder rolled again, closer now, as if nature itself were bearing witness to this midnight revelation. Hollis and Marin gathered their equipment, knowing they had to move quickly before dawn exposed their presence. But they left with more than they'd brought. They left with certainty, with evidence. With purpose. The truth about Lark's disappearance was no longer just a father's desperate theory. It was real, solid, and damning, pulled from the depths of Sloane's hidden pond, ready to shatter the carefully constructed facade of the man who'd thought he could bury his crimes forever. Daybreak found Hollis and Marin huddled at her wildlife clinic's back office, their faces drawn from lack of sleep but their eyes bright with determination. The discovery of Lark's car had changed everything. No longer were they just poking around the edges of Sloane's operation, now they had proof of his crimes. "We need help," Marin said, her fingers drumming nervously on her desk. "Someone with real authority who can't be bought off like Sheriff Parrish." She reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the number she needed. "I know a state game warden, Jack Torres. He's helped me with injured wildlife cases before. More importantly, he has no ties to Sloane or local politics." Hollis nodded, studying the preserve's architectural plans he'd managed to obtain from the county records office. "Make the call. Meanwhile, I think I've found our way in." His weathered finger traced along the power grid lines. The Founder's Retreat runs on its own electrical system, separate from the main grid, probably so Sloane can keep his special activities private. While Marin stepped outside to make her call, Hollis immersed himself in the technical drawings. 20 years of railroad maintenance work had taught him how to read these diagrams like a book. The backup generators, the circuit breakers, the junction boxes. It was all there in black and white. Marin returned 15 minutes later, her expression cautiously optimistic. "Torres will help. He's been suspicious of Sloane's operation for years but never had enough evidence to warrant an investigation. He's willing to look into things quietly." "Good timing," Hollis said, "because Sloane's planning something big. Look at this. He showed her a glossy invitation he'd found in the workshop wreckage, an exclusive night hunt for the preserve's top donors. $5,000 per person for a private after-hours safari experience. Night hunt? Marin's face paled. That's when they'd be most vulnerable. The animals would be groggy, disoriented. Her voice trailed off as she watched two of workers through the clinic window, loading large animal crates onto a truck. And look, they're moving sedatives too. Hollis pointed to several boxes marked with medical symbols being carefully transferred. Whatever Sloane's planning, it's happening soon. They spent the next hour formulating their plan. The Founder's retreat, with its private dining room and observation deck, would be where Sloane would host his wealthy guests before the hunt. If they could cut the power at the right moment and capture his presentation on video, we'll need perfect timing, Marin said, sketching a rough map. The backup generators take 30 seconds to kick in. That's our window to get in position with the camera. Hollis studied the electrical diagrams again. There's a maintenance panel here, behind the building. I can trigger a selective blackout. Just the retreat, not the whole preserve. Make it look like a technical glitch, and I've got this. Marin pulled out a small but professional-looking video camera. Night vision capable will catch everything they say in those 30 seconds of darkness. They worked through every detail, checking and double-checking their timing. Hollis would disable the power while Marin filmed from a hidden position near the deck. If they succeeded, they'd have irrefutable evidence of Sloane's illegal activities. It's not just about exposing the night hunts, Hollis said quietly, his hands clenched. Once we have him on camera, we can pressure him about Lark, about what really happened that night. Marin touched his arm gently, one step at a time. Hollis, first, we catch him in the act. Torres said he'll have a team ready to move as soon as we have solid evidence. They spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies, dark clothes, backup batteries, communication devices. The weight of what they were attempting hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of righteous purpose. For too long, Sloane had operated with impunity, using his money and influence to silence anyone who questioned him. Time to change the game, Hollis said, his voice firm with resolve. No more defense, no more running. Tomorrow night, we take the fight to him. Marin nodded, her expression matching his determination. Tomorrow night, we get the truth about everything. The hidden camera was working perfectly. From their concealed position behind dense brush near the Founder's retreat, Hollis and Marin watched through night vision binoculars as Merritt Sloane paced on the wooden deck, barking orders. At his handlers, the camera they'd planted in a decorative birdhouse captured every word. Clean up that mess before anyone sees it, Sloane commanded, his polished boots clicking against the boards. And make sure those new shipments are properly sedated. This time, we can't have another incident. Hollis's hands trembled as he held the binoculars. After years of wondering what happened to Lark, here was Sloane finally revealing his true nature. The preserve owner's carefully maintained facade had cracked, showing the ruthless man beneath. A twig snapped behind them. Before Hollis could turn, something sharp pricked his neck. His vision blurred as his legs gave way. Through increasingly foggy eyes, he saw Marin grab Juniper and bolt into the darkness as guards emerged from the shadows. "Got's one of them," a gruff voice said. The old mechanic. Hollis tried to fight the tranquilizer, but his limbs felt like lead. Rough hands grabbed him, dragging him across the ground. Through his drugged haze, he heard vehicles approaching, the familiar rumble of Sheriff Parrish's patrol cars. "Secure the perimeter," Parrish's voice boomed. "Find the woman and that cat." They hauled Hollis into the Founder's retreat. Despite his clouded mind, he registered Sloane's satisfied smirk as they bound his hands behind his chair with zip ties. "I warned you to leave well enough alone," Sloane said, circling Hollis like a predator. "Now look where your meddling has gotten you." Hollis struggled to keep his eyes open. "You killed her, killed Lark. Your daughter was too curious for her own good," Sloane replied coldly. "Just like you. Don't worry, you'll disappear just like she did. No one will ever find you either." Through the windows, flashlight beams cut through darkness as deputies searched the grounds. Hollis heard frightened animal cries from the pens as the search parties disturbed them. Somewhere out there, Marin was running with Juniper, trying to escape. He prayed they'd make it. The tranquilizer made it hard to think, but guilt and despair cut through the fog. He'd failed Lark once by not seeing the truth about Sloane years ago. Now he'd failed again. The evidence they'd gathered would die with him, and Sloane's crimes would remain hidden. "The sedative will fully take hold soon," Sloane said, checking his gold watch. "Then we'll take care of our loose end." "Permanently this time?" Hollis's head drooped as consciousness slipped away. The last thing he saw was Sloane's expensive boots stepping toward him before darkness claimed him completely. His last thought was of Lark, and how he'd never get justice for her now. After everything, Sloane had won. The sounds of the search faded as Hollis sank deeper into the drug's grip. His breath came slower and slower. Through it all, Sloane's words echoed in his mind, "You'll disappear just like she did." After all his efforts to uncover the truth, he would share Lark's fate, another victim silenced by Sloane's ruthless greed and corruption. This was how it would end, bound and drugged in Sloane's private retreat, with no one to help him, no chance to expose what he'd learned. No justice for Lark, just endless darkness closing in, carrying him toward what felt like his final moments. All hope was truly lost. Hollis had never felt more alone or defeated than in these moments as unconsciousness took him. Years of grief and searching had led him here, to what would likely be his death. The weight of failure pressed down on him as heavily as the tranquilizer in his system. His last conscious thought was a prayer that at least Marin and Juniper would somehow escape, even if he couldn't. The harsh metallic sound of rattling chains echoed through the feeding bay, sending chills down Hollis's spine. Even through his drug-induced haze, he recognized the distinctive noise of an agitated big cat. His eyes struggled to focus in the dim light as two of Sloane's men dragged him across the concrete floor. A low, menacing growl rolled through the space. Through blurry vision, Hollis made out the muscular form of a female leopard prowling back and forth behind the heavy chain-link barrier. Her ears were flattened against her skull, and her tail lashed in agitation as she fixed her gaze on the guards. "Get that cat under control," one of the men shouted, his voice betraying his nervousness. "She's been acting crazy since we brought in the new shipment." The leopard's muscles bunched as she pressed against the barrier, making the chains rattle more violently. Her eyes gleamed with fierce maternal instinct. Hollis realized with sudden clarity that this must be Juniper's mother, separated from her cub and filled with protective rage. "Just shoot her if she doesn't settle down," Sloane's voice cut through the tension. "We can't risk her interfering with tonight's operation." One of the guards raised his rifle, pointing it at the agitated cat. The metallic click of the safety being released seemed to echo in the confined space, despite the tranquilizer still clouding his system. Hollis knew he couldn't let them hurt her. With strength born of desperate determination, he wrenched free from the loosened grip of his captors. His legs were unsteady, but adrenaline drove him forward as he stumbled between the raised rifle and the leopard. "You'll have to shoot me first," Hollis declared, his voice rough but firm. He spread his arms wide, making himself a human shield. "This ends now." The guard's hands trembled on the rifle. "Get out of the way, old man." "No," Hollis said simply, standing his ground. "You know this isn't right. None of this is right." The leopard had gone still behind him, as if sensing his intervention. Her growl softened to a rumble, but her presence remained in intense force at his back. "Are you crazy?" another guard hissed. "That cat will tear you apart." "Maybe," Hollis acknowledged, "but I'm done watching people hurt the innocent. Done being quiet while Sloane destroys lives, human and animal alike." His words seemed to strike a nerve. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence visibly wavering. They'd signed up to provide security for a safari preserve, not to be accomplices to murder and animal abuse. In that moment of hesitation, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. Hollis's heart leaped. Marin's distress call had worked. She'd managed to contact the game wardens before being discovered. Taking advantage of the guard's distraction, Hollis lunged for the electrical panel he'd studied earlier. His fingers found the loosened breaker he'd prepared during his earlier maintenance work. With one firm pull, he triggered the emergency lockdown system. Heavy steel gates slammed down throughout the compound with thunderous force, sealing off escape routes. The guards' radios crackled with panicked voices as Sloane's men found themselves trapped in various sections of the preserve. "What have you done?" one of the guards demanded, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "Given justice a chance?" Hollis answered, his voice steady, despite his exhaustion. The sirens were getting closer now, their urgent wail mixing with the sound of approaching vehicles on the preserve service roads. The leopard behind him had settled into a watchful crouch, no longer rattling her enclosure. Somehow, she seemed to understand that the tide had turned. Her eyes remained fixed on the guards, but the murderous rage had subsided to wary attention. Through the high windows of the feeding bay, emergency lights began to strobe across the walls, red and blue flashes that signaled the arrival of law enforcement. The game wardens had brought reinforcements, and from the sound of it, plenty of them. Hollis sagged against the wall, the last of his strength ebbing as the tranquilizer reasserted itself. But he remained conscious enough to hear the chaos unfolding. Outside, car doors slamming, voices shouting commands, the sound of running feet on gravel. Justice was finally arriving at Sloane's preserve, and this time, there would be no smooth talking or political maneuvering to hide the truth. The night's evidence was too overwhelming. The witnesses to numerous, and Hollis's long vigil was at last bearing fruit. The leopard mother rumbled softly behind him, and Hollis felt a surge of kinship with the protective parent. They had both lost their children to Sloane's cruelty, but tonight marked the beginning of making things right. Soon, she would be reunited with Juniper, and Hollis would finally uncover the full truth about what happened to Lark. The night exploded, with flashing lights as game warden vehicles stormed through the preserve's gates. Their sirens pierced the darkness, echoing across the compound. Hollis watched from the feeding bay as uniformed officers poured out of trucks and SUVs. There, flashlights cutting through the shadows like searching fingers, hands where we can see them. The lead warden's voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is a state-authorized raid." Sloane's face drained of color as wardens surrounded the building. Sheriff Parrish tried to flash his badge, but the state officers weren't impressed. "Sheriff Parrish, you're part of this investigation." Put your hands behind your back. 2 wardens approached with handcuffs while others secured the handlers. Sloane's polished facade cracked completely. His eyes darted wildly, until they landed on a rifle leaning against the wall. With a desperate snarl, he lunged for the weapon. No, Hollis's body moved before his mind could catch up. Despite his aching muscles and the lingering effects of the tranquilizer, he tackled Sloane with all his remaining strength. They crashed to the concrete floor together, Sloane's fingers just inches from the rifle. Wardens rushed in to secure Sloane, who thrashed and cursed as they cuffed him. Marin appeared in the doorway, clutching a small device. "We got everything," she said, holding up Juniper's collar. The camera caught it all. The illegal sedatives, the night hunts, everything they said about Lark. The lead warden nodded grimly. "Between this footage and that car you folks dredged up, we've got them dead to rights. Multiple federal violations, conspiracy, and enough evidence to reopen your daughter's case. Mr. Greer." Dawn broke over the preserve as the arrests continued. Hollis watched Sloane and Parrish being led to separate vehicles, their authority stripped away in the growing light. The handlers followed, heads bowed, their secrets finally exposed. 3 days later, Hollis stood in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The morning was quiet except for birdsong and the rustle of oak leaves. A fresh granite marker bore Lark's name, and beneath it, Hollis carefully placed the wooden bluebird charm that had started everything. "I'm sorry it took so long, sweetheart," he whispered, touching the cool stone. "But they can't hurt anyone else now." Marin stood respectfully behind him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. They'd grown close through their ordeal, 2 wounded souls finding strength in each other's company. When Hollis finally straightened up, she handed him a tissue without comment. Later that week, they drove Juniper to a wildlife sanctuary 3 counties over. The facility sprawled across 50 acres, with natural enclosures and dedicated veterinary staff. Hollis's heart ached as he signed the transfer papers, but he knew it was right. "She'll have a good life here," the sanctuary director assured them. "Thanks to you both. She'll never know cruelty again." They watched Juniper explore her new enclosure, her spotted coat gleaming in the sunlight. She looked back once, as if to say goodbye, before disappearing into the tall grass. "Ready to get started on that barn?" Marin asked as they drove home. She'd been talking about expanding her rescue facility, and Hollis had offered to help. "More than ready," he replied. For the first time in years, his voice held no trace of darkness. The next morning, Hollis stood in Marin's pasture, marking foundation points for the new rescue barn. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of hope, soft, pink and gold, replacing the heavy grays that had haunted him for so long. His tool belt felt familiar around his waist, and his hands were steady as he checked his measurements. Marin brought him coffee in his favorite thermos, her auburn hair catching the early light. "I'm thinking we'll need at least 6 recovery stalls," she said, unrolling the plans they'd drawn together. Hollis nodded, seeing not just blueprint lines but a future taking shape. The truth about Lark had finally come to light, and while nothing could bring her back, he could honor her memory by helping other vulnerable creatures find safety and healing. 6 stalls to start, he agreed, picking up his hammer, "and we'll make them strong." The morning air filled with the sounds of honest work, measuring, cutting, building something new from the ashes of the past. With each board he placed, each nail he drove home, Hollis felt the weight of grief lifting. In its place grew something he'd thought lost forever: peace, purpose, and the quiet joy of beginning again. If this ending felt like it was written for you, subscribe and join me tomorrow for another story that might feel the same.